Sometimes it's not the illness that hurts the most. It's who doesn't show up for you when you need them the most. Hello, my name is Helen Whitford. I'm 72 years old. And before I dive into this story, I want to ask, where are you watching from today? I love to know the places these words reach, the towns and cities where other hearts like mine sit, listening, perhaps nodding in quiet recognition. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. A sterile hospital room where I lay with tubes in my arm and machines beeping gently at my side. I had suffered a minor stroke. The doctors told me I was lucky. Lucky it wasn't worse. Lucky I'd gotten there in time. But as the hours stretched into days, I realized luck was a cruel word. Because while I was battling fear and loneliness, my family, the very people I had given my life to, were nowhere to be found. At first, I told myself they must be busy. My son Daniel worked in finance, always darting in and out of meetings. My daughter Lisa had her hands full with her own family. My grandchildren lived just 20 minutes away. I had hoped maybe they'd sneak in after school, their laughter lighting up the room. But nobody came, not once. On the third day, I asked a nurse if anyone had called. She shook her head, then hesitated, her eyes soft with pity. "Your children must be traveling," she said, as though it explained everything. Traveling? My heart gave a painful thump. I pressed her for details, and she admitted that she'd overheard one of the younger nurses chatting. That my family had flown to Europe. While I lay in a hospital bed, scared I might not wake up the next morning. They were smiling for photographs under the Eiffel Tower. The betrayal didn't land all at once. It sank in slowly, like ice water dripping into my veins. I thought back to every moment I had been there for them. The nights I sat up with Daniel when he had the flu. The mornings I packed Lisa's school lunches with little notes tucked inside. The sacrifices I made after my husband died so they could still attend good schools. And now, not even a phone call, not even a text. I stared at the ceiling that night, listening to the hum of the machines, and I realized something I'd never allowed myself to think before. Maybe I wasn't family anymore. Maybe I was just convenient. A wallet, a babysitter, a spare room they could use when it suited them. But love, respect, those were long gone. When the doctor finally cleared me to go home, I should have felt relief. Instead, a cold dread filled me, because home didn't mean warmth anymore. Home meant the place where my absence hadn't been noticed. I hailed a cab outside the hospital and gave the driver my address. The ride was quiet. The world outside the window bustled with life. Families laughed together on sidewalks. Children tugged at their parents' hands. Couples shared ice cream cones. I watched them with a hollow ache in my chest. They didn't know how lucky they were. When we pulled up to my house, something inside me braced. The grass was overgrown. Newspapers piled up on the porch as though the house itself had been abandoned. My heart clenched when I saw the mailbox stuffed to bursting with bills and letters. Not one had been touched. Not one hand had reached out in my absence. I dragged my small hospital bag up the steps, fumbling with the key. And when the door creaked open, I was hit by the stale, empty air of neglect. My home felt foreign, cold. Dust lingered on the furniture. A plate sat in the sink, hardened food clinging to its surface as though someone had tossed it there before rushing out the door. And then I saw it, the credit card statement lying open on the counter. Thousands of dollars charged in restaurants, boutiques, hotels, dates that aligned perfectly with their vacation. They hadn't just left me. They had used me, my name, my money, my trust, all while I lay in a hospital bed waiting for someone to care. I sank into the nearest chair, the weight of it all pressing down on my chest. And for the first time in my 72 years, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet voice whispered in the back of my mind, "If they can leave you behind, you can leave them too." And right then, I knew this story wasn't going to end the way they thought. The next morning, I walked through each room of my house slowly, as though I were a stranger in a museum. Every corner told a story I hadn't noticed before. The framed photographs on the walls, smiles, graduations, birthdays, suddenly looked staged, hollow. I pressed my fingertips against the glass of one picture, the last Christmas I had hosted, with Daniel and Lisa at the table. I remembered the warmth of that night, but now all I could see was how quickly they had eaten and left, barely thanking me, already making plans for their own lives while I scraped dishes into the sink. I opened the stack of mail piled on the kitchen counter, bills, overdue notices, my electricity was nearly cut off, insurance warnings, a property tax reminder. My children hadn't even bothered to keep the basics afloat while they drained my account for Paris dinners and souvenirs. The worst was the credit card summary. I sat at the table, tracing each line with my finger, my vision blurring with disbelief. Plane tickets to France, luxury hotels, a shopping spree at some boutique I couldn't even pronounce. They had been drinking champagne on my dime while I was eating hospital soup alone, I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear me. How could you? It was then that Mrs. Kendall, my neighbor from across the street, knocked gently on my door. She peeked in with her warm smile, holding a pie dish. "Helen, you're home. I was worried when I saw the ambulance weeks ago." "I'm so glad you're all right." Her kindness made my throat tighten. I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, dear." Just getting back on my feet. She glanced at the empty driveway, then chuckled. "Your kids looked like they were having the time of their lives. I saw them loading up suitcases just last week, heading for the airport. Off to Europe, wasn't it?" Her words landed like knives. I swallowed hard and nodded again, pretending I already knew. "Yes," I said softly. "Europe." When she left, I sank into my chair and let out a long breath. So it was true, not just gossip, not an exaggeration. They hadn't even bothered to keep it secret. They had paraded their laughter down my driveway, bags packed, while I was still lying under fluorescent hospital lights. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not in rage. No, rage would have been too easy. What filled me was colder, steadier, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I realized that for too long I had been clinging to the idea of family, of what it should mean. I excused their sharp words, their absence on birthdays, their dismissive laughter when I tried to share stories from my past. I told myself it was just the times, that kids grew up, moved on, didn't have the same traditions we once did. But this, leaving me in a hospital bed, draining my accounts while they toured cathedrals, this was no misunderstanding. This was a choice, and if they had chosen to leave me behind, then I had the right to make a choice too. That night, I lay awake in my bed, our bed, the one I had shared with my late husband for decades. The house felt too big, too empty, and yet suffocating. The silence pressed against my ears. I thought of him, of how disappointed he would be in the children we raised, of how fiercely he had once loved this family. My chest ached at the thought. But then came another feeling. Resolve. I whispered into the darkness. It ends here. No more waiting for phone calls that wouldn't come. No more opening my wallet while they sneered at my old-fashioned ways. No more being the safety net, the doormat, the forgotten mother. The next morning I reached for the phone. Not to call them, but to make an appointment. A locksmith. If they could walk away from me so easily, then it was time I learned how to walk away from them. The locksmith arrived on a Tuesday morning, his van pulling up quietly in front of my house. A young man, maybe in his 30s, with strong hands and a kind smile. He tipped his cap as I opened the door. "Morning, Mom. You called about new locks?" I nodded firmly. "Yes, all of them. Every door, every entry point. I don't want anyone using the old keys again." He blinked in surprise, then nodded. "Of course we can take care of that." As I watched him work, the sound of drills and the clink of metal filled the house like music. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like a note of freedom. My children had treated this house as their playground, marching in when they wanted, using the spare key, acting as though my space was theirs to control. Not anymore. From that moment on, my doors would open only for me. When he finished, he handed me a small envelope of new keys. They felt heavier than I expected, almost symbolic. I slid one into my pocket, gripping it tightly, like I was holding on to the first piece of myself I'd reclaimed in years. That afternoon, I stood in the driveway, staring at the car, sitting there like a silent witness. It was a faded sedan, a little old, but it had history. My late husband and I had saved for years to buy it outright. I remembered us driving along country roads with the windows down, music on the radio, the smell of fresh fields drifting in. That car had been freedom once, but recently Daniel and Lisa had scoffed at it. "Why don't you just sell this old thing? You don't even drive anymore," Daniel had said dismissively. Well, I decided perhaps I would sell it, but not in the way they imagined. The very next day, I placed a call to a dealership. Within a week, I had sold the car and transferred the money into a new account, one they didn't know existed. Watching the car drive away was bittersweet, but also liberating. They had mocked it, claimed it was useless. Yet here it was, funding my independence. Still, I knew I needed more than locks and empty driveways. I needed clarity, proof, something to remind myself when doubt crept in that I wasn't being dramatic or unfair. So I sat down at the dining table with a thick ledger book. One by one, I began collecting everything: credit card statements, bank withdrawals, unpaid bills. I stacked them neatly, highlighting each date that aligned with their so-called vacation. The numbers told a story even sharper than words. $500 here, $200 there, hotel stays, designer stores. And alongside each charge, I wrote down what I had been doing that day. June 12th, $900 at Louis Vuitton. I was undergoing MRI scans. June 15th, $320 dinner at Café de Paris. I was being told I might not recover fully. June 18th, $100 for flight upgrades. I was lying in a hospital bed, waiting for someone to hold my hand. The contrast was so stark it made my hands tremble. But those pages, filled with ink and pain, hardened my resolve. This wasn't just neglect. It was betrayal. Financial theft hidden under the mask of family. When I closed the ledger, I whispered to myself, "This is my record, and someday it will be theirs too." But before I revealed anything, I wanted to ensure that I was truly free. My locks were changed. My car was gone. My accounts were separated. Slowly, I was cutting the threads that tied me to their control. That night, I sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the trees, the warm glow washing over my face. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet thrill of being in charge of my own life. My children had left me behind, but what they didn't know, what they would never see coming, was that I was preparing to leave them behind too. And unlike them, I wouldn't be sneaking away on a plane. I'd be walking out the front door, locking it behind me, and never looking back. The decision to sell the house came quietly, like a whisper that turned into a roar. At first, I only meant to distance myself, change the locks, and keep my money safe. But as the days passed, the silence of those empty rooms pressed on me. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow in the hallway reminded me of birthdays that had gone uncelebrated, of dinners where laughter was forced, of nights I waited for phone calls that never came. Why was I clinging to four walls that no longer sheltered love? So I picked up the phone again. This time I called a realtor. Her name was Monica, a sharp woman in her 40s with an efficient smile. She walked through the house with a practiced eye, jotting notes and snapping photos. "It's a good property," she said. "Solid bones. With a few updates, it could fetch a very nice price." I nodded, pretending her words were just about business. But inside I felt a pang of something deeper. This had been the house where my husband carried me across the threshold on our wedding night. The house where my children took their first steps, where we gathered for Thanksgivings, where I kissed him goodbye before his final trip to the hospital. Letting go felt like betrayal, until I remembered how easily they had betrayed me. That night, I sat in the living room surrounded by boxes. I began sorting through belongings with careful hands. My husband's old pocket watch. I slipped it into a velvet pouch to take with me. The quilt my mother made when I was a girl. I folded it tenderly, pressing it to my cheek before tucking it away. But the things my children always claimed as theirs. The china set Lisa insisted she'd inherit. The desk Daniel said he'd use when he took over the accounts. I left behind because they would soon discover something they hadn't expected. Nothing in that house belonged to them anymore. As the realtor prepared the listing, I began quietly selling smaller things: furniture, paintings, appliances. Strangers came and went, handing me envelopes of cash. Each sale felt like shedding another layer of weight I had carried for far too long. The rooms grew barer, the echoes louder. But instead of sadness, I felt a strange exhilaration. I wasn't just packing, I was reclaiming. The money from the sales went into my private account. I spoke with a lawyer, ensuring all documents were ironclad. I even updated my will, a step I had avoided for years because I had always assumed my children would handle things responsibly. But now I left specific instructions. Every penny I had would go to charity, to scholarships for children who actually deserved a chance. Not to those who had abandoned me when I needed them most. Still, I wanted them to know why, to feel it, not just see the empty spaces. So one afternoon, I pulled down the old family photo album from the top shelf of the closet. Its pages were filled with moments: birthdays with frosting on little faces, vacations with sandy toes, my husband's proud smile at graduations. I flipped through slowly, my heart aching with the weight of memory. Then I slipped an envelope between the pages. Inside were copies of the ledger entries, credit card statements, and a handwritten note. This is what family did to me. While I lay in a hospital bed, you chose Paris. While I struggled to breathe, you chose champagne. This house, this money, this trust, it is no longer yours. I'm no longer yours. Consider this album the last memory we share. I placed the album carefully back on the shelf, knowing it would be one of the first things they looked for when they came back. Finally, with everything in motion, I booked a small cottage in a quiet seaside town. Nothing grand, but it was mine. A place where no footsteps would trample my peace, where no laughter would cut like knives. The night before I left, I walked through the empty house one last time. Each room held a memory, and each memory hurt. But as I locked the door behind me, a calm smile spread across my face. For once, I wasn't the one being left behind. It was a Sunday afternoon when they came back. I wasn't there to see it, but I can picture it as clearly as if I'd been sitting across the street with a lawn chair and a glass of iced tea. The taxi pulled up first, heavy with luggage. My son Daniel stepped out, his sunglasses perched on his head, the kind of smug grin that came from weeks of luxury. His wife followed, pulling a designer bag I knew had been charged to my card. Lisa arrived in a separate car with her children, chatting loudly on her phone, her laughter sharp and careless. They looked tan, rested, brimming with stories to tell about their adventures. They walked up the driveway, rolling their suitcases, expecting the same home they had left behind. Then came the first stumble. Daniel pulled out his key, slid it into the lock, and nothing. He frowned, tried again, jiggled it harder. Still nothing. "Lisa," he called over his shoulder, irritation already creeping into his voice. "Did you change the lock for some reason?" She gave him a confused look. "Why would I do that?" "Let me try." Her key failed too. One by one they all tried, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt. The children whined, tugging at their parents' clothes. Daniel cursed under his breath, rattling the handle like the door owed him something. And then the real shock hit. Lisa pressed her face against the window. "Daniel, the house, it's empty." He shoved her aside, peering in himself. The furniture gone. The walls bare, the shelves stripped. Nothing remained but echoes. I imagine his stomach must have dropped, the color draining from his sunburnt face. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. The neighbors had noticed, of course. Mrs. Kendall waved cheerfully from across the street, her apron dusted with flour. "Oh, hello. You just missed your mother. She moved out weeks ago." Their heads snapped toward her. Lisa's jaw fell open. Daniel stalked toward her, his voice sharp. "Moved? What do you mean moved? Where?" But Mrs. Kendall just blinked in surprise. "Didn't she tell you? Packed everything up. Sold the car, too." She seemed so happy about it. That was when the panic truly set in. They pulled out their phones, calling me over and over. Ring after ring. My phone lit up in my cottage by the sea, where I sat sipping tea and listening to the waves. I didn't answer. I let the silence speak louder than I ever could. Finally, they noticed the envelope taped to the front door. Daniel ripped it off, tore it open, and began to read. His face stiffened with every word. Lisa peered over his shoulder, her lips trembling as her eyes darted across the page. "Don't worry. The bills are paid. The car is gone. And so am I. This house no longer belongs to you because it never did. While you were sipping champagne in Paris, I was lying in a hospital bed alone. You didn't come. You didn't call. But you did remember to use my money. I hope the memories you made were worth the cost. Because you've lost me and everything I once gave so freely." By the time they finished, their children were asking questions. "Where's Grandma? Why can't we go inside?" And there stood Daniel and Lisa, faces pale, clutching a letter that told them what they never thought possible. Their safety net had been cut. Their mother, the one they mocked, ignored, and drained dry, had finally vanished from their grasp. I imagined Daniel's anger boiling over, Lisa's tears spilling down her cheeks, their voices rising in panic. But none of that reached me. In my quiet little cottage, I set the phone aside, stretched my legs, and smiled to myself. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the one waiting by the door. They were. It didn't take long for them to track me down. A week, maybe less. I was sitting in my little seaside cottage one afternoon, the salty breeze drifting in through the window, when I heard the sound of a car door slamming outside. Heavy footsteps followed. Then came the pounding on the door. I didn't move right away. I just sat there sipping my tea, letting them stew in their impatience. Finally, I rose and opened the door. Daniel stood there, his face flushed with anger, his tie loose around his neck as though he'd driven straight from the city without bothering to adjust himself. Lisa hovered behind him, her eyes red from crying, arms folded tight across her chest. "Mom!" Daniel barked, pushing past me into the cottage without asking. "What the hell is going on?" "The locks are changed. The house is empty. The car is gone. Where is everything?" I shut the door quietly behind him and walked back to my chair. "Sit down if you like," I said calmly. "But I won't be yelled at in my own home." He turned to me, eyes blazing. "Our home, that house." "No," I interrupted, my voice steady as stone. "It was never yours. Not one brick, not one blade of grass. Your father and I built that life. I kept it standing after he passed. You only ever took from it." Lisa finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Mom, how could you do this? We came back and everything's gone. We thought you'd be waiting for us." I let out a bitter laugh. "Waiting? That's all I ever did. I waited on birthdays for calls that never came. I waited in hospital rooms for visits that never happened. I waited while you drained my accounts, hoping it was a mistake. But when I saw the charges from Paris, when I lay in that bed wondering if I'd live or die, and you were raising glasses of champagne instead of holding my hand, something inside me broke." Daniel's jaw clenched. "We were on vacation. You could have told us you were in the hospital. You are my children. I shouldn't have had to beg for your presence. Love is not something that waits for a scheduled phone call. And don't pretend ignorance because you knew. You chose Europe over me." Silence filled the room, broken only by the crash of waves against the shore outside. Lisa's eyes brimmed with tears. "But the house, the inheritance, we thought—" "That's exactly the problem," I cut in sharply. "You thought of me as a bank account, as a deed, as a future payout, not as a mother, not as a person. So I made my choice. The house is sold. The money is in accounts you cannot touch, and my will. Not a penny goes to either of you. Every cent will go to causes that honor people who know the meaning of compassion. Children who actually need a chance, not grown adults who abandoned their mother." Daniel's face turned red, his hands balling into fists. "You can't just cut us off like this." I met his glare with unwavering eyes. "I already did." Lisa broke then, sinking into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "We just thought you'd always be there, that you'd forgive us." My chest ached at the sight, but I didn't soften. "I was there for decades. I gave until there was nothing left. And what did you give me in return? Silence, debt, betrayal. You don't get to play the part of grieving children when you never played the part of loving ones." They sat in stunned silence. For the first time, I think they realized I wasn't bluffing, that I wasn't just an old woman they could guilt into submission. Finally, I stood, moving to the door. "You should go now." Daniel's mouth opened to argue, but something in my eyes stopped him. Lisa rose slowly, her shoulders sagging, her face streaked with tears. Without another word, they walked out. As the door clicked shut behind them, I exhaled deeply. My hands trembled, but my heart felt strangely light. For the first time in my life, I had spoken the truth without fear, and for once they had been forced to listen. The cottage is quiet now, except for the steady rhythm of the waves outside my window. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in a shawl, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The gulls wheel above, the air smells of salt and lavender, and I think to myself, this is peace. This is mine. It has been weeks since that confrontation. Daniel and Lisa tried to call again, but I let the phone ring. There are no more frantic knocks on my door. No more guilt-ridden letters slipped under it. Perhaps they finally realized that their old tricks don't work anymore. Or perhaps they've simply given up. Either way, the silence is a gift. I won't lie to you. It hurts. A mother's heart never stops aching, even when it's been broken beyond repair. There are nights when I wake up wondering if I was too harsh, if I should have given them one more chance. But then I remember the hospital bed, the empty chair beside me, the credit card statements with their Paris dinners, and I remind myself I didn't abandon them. They abandoned me. People often talk about growing old as though it's only about aches and wrinkles, about canes and prescriptions. But what nobody tells you is how heavy betrayal feels when it comes from the people you loved most. It's not your bones that weigh you down. It's disappointment. But here's what I've learned. You can set that weight down. I changed the locks, sold the car, and left behind the house because I finally understood something simple. Family is not defined by blood or by the walls you share. Family is defined by love, respect, and presence. And if those things aren't there, then all you have is strangers with your last name. I have found my peace in this little cottage. My neighbors stop by with pies and kind words. I walk along the shoreline and greet fishermen hauling in their nets. Sometimes the grandchildren of the couple next door visit me, and we sit together drawing pictures in the sand. They listen to my stories with wide eyes, and in their laughter I hear something I thought I'd lost: belonging. And maybe, just maybe, that's where my legacy will go. Not to those who treated me as a wallet, but to children who know kindness when they see it. So, if you're watching this and you felt that sting too, being overlooked, being treated as though your years of sacrifice meant nothing, I want you to hear me. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to choose peace over pain, dignity over duty, self-respect over sacrifice. I spent 72 years waiting for love to come back the way I gave it. It never did. And that's all right, because I finally stopped waiting. Now I wake up to the sound of the sea, to the warmth of sunlight on my face, to the joy of knowing that my life is finally mine again. And that is worth more than any inheritance, any title, any fleeting approval from those who never valued me to begin with. So tonight, when I close this journal and set my teacup on the table, I'll whisper a quiet thank you. Not to them, but to myself. Thank you for finally walking away. Thank you for choosing freedom. Thank you for remembering that I was always worth more than their neglect. And maybe, just maybe, I'll whisper it to you too. Wherever you are, whoever you are listening to my story tonight, don't wait as long as I did. Your peace is waiting. Go claim it.